Gorgias was a Greek sophist, Italiator, pre-Socratic philosopher and rhetorician who was a native of Leontini in Sicily. Along with Protagoras, he forms the first generation of sophists. Several doxographers report that he was a pupil of Empedocles, although he would only have been a few years younger. Like other sophists, he was an itinerant, practicing in various cities and giving public exhibitions of his skill at the great Pan-Hellenic centers of Olympia and Delphi, and charged fees for his instruction and performances. A special feature of his displays was to invite miscellaneous questions from the audience and give impromptu replies. He is sometimes called Gorgias the Nihilist, although the degree to which this epithet adequately describes his philosophy is controversial. His chief claim to recognition is that he transplanted rhetoric from his native Sicily to Attica, and contributed to the diffusion of the Attic dialect as the language of literary prose. Life. Gorgias originated from Leontini, a Greek colony in Sicily, and what is often called the home of Spartan rhetoric. It is known that Gorgias had a father named Charmantides and two siblings, a brother named Herodicus and a sister who dedicated a statue to Gorgias. In Delphi, he was already about 60 when in 427 BC he was sent to Athens by his fellow citizens at the head of an embassy to ask for Athenian protection against the aggression of the Syracusans. He subsequently settled in Athens, probably due to the enormous popularity of his style of oratory and the profits made from his performances and rhetoric classes. According to Aristotle, his students included Isocrates. Gorgias is reputed to have lived to be 108 years old. He won admiration for his ability to speak on any subject. He accumulated considerable wealth, enough to commission a gold statue of himself for a public temple. After his Pythian oration, the Greeks installed a solid gold statue of him in the temple of Apollo at Delphi. He died at Larissa in Thessaly. Nihilist. Gorgias has been labeled the nihilist because some scholars have interpreted his thesis on the non-existent to be an argument against the existence of anything. Nihilism is the belief that all values are baseless and that nothing can be known or communicated. It is associated with pessimism and a radical skepticism that condemns existence. Gorgias's philosophy is that nothing at all exists, the full extent of which is told in his On Non-Existence, where he develops three sequential arguments. First, that nothing exists. Second, that even if existence exists, it is inapprehensible to humans. And third, that even if existence is apprehensible, it certainly cannot be communicated or interpreted to one's neighbors. Assuming that it was at one time a written text, there is no evidence of what Gorgias originally wrote. What we know is from commentary by Sextus Empiricus and Pseudo-Aristotle's De Melisso, Xenophane. Gorgia. Rhetorical innovation. Gorgias ushered in rhetorical innovations involving structure and ornamentation and the introduction of paradoxologia, the idea of paradoxical thought and paradoxical expression. For these advancements, Gorgias has been labeled the father of sophistry. Gorgias is also known for contributing to the diffusion of the Attic dialect as the language of literary prose. Gorgias was the first orator to develop and teach a distinctive style of speaking. Gorgias' extant rhetorical works, Encomium of Helen, Defense of Palamedes, On Non-Existence, and Epitaphius, come to us via a work entitled Techni, a manual of rhetorical instruction, which may have consisted of models to be memorized and demonstrate various principles of rhetorical practice. Although some scholars claim that each work presents opposing statements, the four texts can be read as interrelated contributions to the up-and-coming theory and art of rhetoric. Of Gorgias' surviving works, only the Encomium and the Defense are believed to exist in their entirety. Meanwhile, there are his own speeches, rhetorical, political, or other. A number of these are referred to and quoted by Aristotle, including a speech on Hellenic unity, a funeral oration for Athenians fallen in war, and a brief quotation from an encomium on the Hellenes. Apart from the speeches, There are paraphrases of the treatise on nature or the non-existent. These works are each part of the Diels-Kranz collection, and although academics consider this source reliable, many of the works included are fragmentary and corrupt. Questions have also been raised as to the authenticity and accuracy of the texts attributed to Gorgias. Gorgias' writings are both rhetorical and performative. He goes to great lengths to exhibit his ability of making an absurd, argumentative position appear stronger. Consequently, each of his works defend positions that are unpopular, paradoxical and even absurd. The performative nature of Gorgias' writings is exemplified by the way that he playfully approaches each argument with stylistic devices such as parody, artificial figuration and theatricality. Gorgias' style of argumentation can be described as poetics minus the meter. Gorgias argues that persuasive words have power that is equivalent to that of the gods and as strong as physical force. In the encomium, Gorgias likens the effect of speech on the soul to the effect of drugs on the body. Just as different drugs draw forth different humors from the body, some putting a stop to disease, others to life, so too with words. Some cause pain, others joy, some strike fear, some stir the audience to boldness, some benumb and bewitch the soul with evil persuasion. The encomium argues for the totalizing power of language. Gorgias also believed that his magical incantations would bring healing to the human psyche by controlling powerful emotions. He paid particular attention to the sounds of words, which, like poetry, could captivate audiences. His florid, rhyming style seemed to hypnotize his audiences. Gorgias' legendary powers of persuasion would suggest that he had a somewhat preternatural influence over his audience and their emotions. Unlike other sophists, such as Protagoras, Gorgias did not profess to teach a rite. He believed that there was no absolute form of a rite, but that it was relative to each situation. His thought was that rhetoric, the art of persuasion, was the king of all sciences, since it was capable of persuading any course of action. While rhetoric existed in the curriculum of every sophist, Gorgias placed more prominence upon it than any of the others. Much debate over both the nature and value of rhetoric begins with Gorgias. Plato's dialogue entitled Gorgias presents a counter-argument to Gorgias' embrace of rhetoric, its elegant form, and performative nature. The dialogue attempts to show that rhetoric does not meet the requirements to actually be considered a technique but is a somewhat dangerous knack to possess both for the orator and for his audience, because it gives the ignorant the power to seem more knowledgeable than an expert to a group. On the non-existent. Gorgias is the author of a lost work, On Nature or the Non-Existent. Rather than being one of his rhetorical works, it presented a theory of being that at the same time refuted and parodied the Eleatic thesis. The original text was lost and today there remain just two paraphrases of it. The first is preserved by the philosopher Sextus Empiricus in Against the Professors and the other by the anonymous author of On Melissus, Xenophanes, and Gorgias. Each work, however, excludes material that is discussed in the other, which suggests that each version may represent intermediary sources. It is clear, however, that the work developed a skeptical argument, which has been extracted from the sources and translated as below. Nothing exists. Even if something exists, nothing can be known about it, and, even if something can be known about it, knowledge about it can't be communicated to others. Even if it can be communicated, it cannot be understood. The argument has largely been seen as an ironic refutation of Parmenides' thesis on being. Gorgias set out to prove that it is as easy to demonstrate that being is one, unchanging and timeless as it is to prove that being has no existence at all. Regardless of how it has largely been seen, it seems clear that Gorgias was focused instead on the notion that true objectivity is impossible since the human mind can never be separated from its possessor. How can anyone communicate the idea of color by means of words since the ear does not hear colors but only sounds? This quote written by the Sicilian philosopher Gorgias, was used to show his theory that there is nothing. If there were anything, no one would know it, and if anyone did know it, no one could communicate it. This theory, thought of in the late 5th century BC, is still being contemplated by many philosophers throughout the world. This argument has led him to label Gorgias a nihilist. For the first main argument, where Gorgias says, there is no thing, he tries to persuade the reader in that thought and existence are not the same. By claiming that if thought and existence truly were the same, then everything that anyone thought would suddenly exist. He also attempted to prove that words and sensations couldn't be measured by the same standards. For even though words and sensations are both derived from the mind, they are essentially different. This is where his second idea comes into place. Rhetorical works. Encomium of Helen. The Encomium of Helen is considered to be a good example of epideutic oratory and was supposed to have been Gorgias' show piece, or demonstration piece, which was used to attract students. In their writings, Gorgias and other sophists speculated about the structure and function of language as a framework for expressing the implications of action and the ways decisions about such actions were made. And this is exactly the purpose of Gorgias' Encomium of Helen. Of the three divisions of rhetoric discussed by Aristotle in his Rhetoric, the encomium can be classified as an epideutic speech, expressing praise for Helen of Troy and ridding her of the blame she faced for leaving Sparta with Paris. Helen, the proverbial Helen of Troy, exemplified both sexual passion and tremendous beauty for the Greeks. She was the daughter of Zeus and Leda, the queen of Sparta, and her beauty was the direct cause of the decade-long Trojan War between Greece and Troy. The war began after the goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite asked Paris to select who was the most beautiful of the three. Each goddess tried to influence Paris's decision, but he ultimately chose Aphrodite, who then promised Paris the most beautiful woman. Paris then traveled to Greece, where he was greeted by Helen and her husband Menelaus. Under the influence of Aphrodite, Helen allowed Paris to persuade her to elope with him. Together they traveled to Troy, not only sparking the war, but also a popular and literary tradition of blaming Helen for her wrongdoing. It is this tradition which Gorgias confronts in the Encomium. The encomium opens with Gorgias explaining that a man, woman, speech, deed, city or action that is worthy of praise should be honored with acclaim, but the unworthy should be branded with blame. In the speech, Gorgias discusses the possible reasons for Helen's journey to Troy. He explains that Helen could have been persuaded in one of four ways: by the gods, by physical force, by love, or by speech. If it were indeed the plan of the gods that caused Helen to depart for Troy, Gorgias argues that those who blame her should face blame themselves, for a human's anticipation cannot restrain a god's inclination. Gorgias explains that, by nature, the weak are ruled by the strong, and, since the gods are stronger than humans in all respects, Helen should be freed from her undesirable reputation. If, however, Helen was abducted by force, it is clear that the aggressor committed a crime. Thus, it should be he, not Helen, who should be blamed. And if Helen was persuaded by love, she should also be rid of ill repute, because, if love is a god, with the divine power of the gods, how could a weaker person refuse and reject him? But if love is a human sickness and a mental weakness, it must not be blamed as mistake, but claimed as misfortune. Finally, if speech persuaded Helen, Gorgias claims he can easily clear her of blame. Gorgias explains, speech is a powerful master and achieves the most divine feats with the smallest and least evident body. It can stop fear, relieve pain, create joy, and increase pity. It is here that Gorgias compares the effect of speech on the mind with the effect of drugs on the body. He states that Helen has the power to lead many bodies in competition by using her body as a weapon. This image of bodies led and misled, brought together and led apart, is of paramount importance in Gorgias' speech. The encomium demonstrates Gorgias' love of paradoxologia. The performative nature of the encomium requires a reciprocal relationship between the performer and the audience, one which relies on the cooperation between the deceptive performer and the equally deceived audience. Gorgias reveals this paradox in the final section of the encomium, where he writes, "I wish to write this speech for Helen's encomium and my amusement." Additionally, if one were to accept Gorgias' argument for Helen's exoneration, it would fly in the face of the whole literary tradition of blame directed towards Helen. This too is paradoxical. While Gorgias primarily used metaphors and paradox, he famously used figures of speech, or schemata. This included balanced clauses, the joining of contrasting ideas, the structure of successive clauses, and the repetition of word endings. The encomium shows Gorgias' interest in argumentation, as he makes his point by systematically refuting a series of possible alternatives. It is an encomium of the rhetorical craft itself, and of demonstration of its power over us. According to Van Hook, the encomium of Helen abounds in amplification and brevity, a rhythm making prose akin to poetry, bold metaphors and poetic or unusual epithets. Defense of Palamedes. In the Defense of Palamedes, Gorgias describes logos as a positive instrument for creating ethical arguments. The defense, an oration that deals with issues of morality and political commitment, defends Palamedes, who, in Greek mythology, is credited with the invention of the alphabet, written laws, numbers, armor, and measures and weights. In the speech, Palamedes defends himself against the charge of treason. In Greek mythology, Odysseus, in order to avoid going to Troy with Agamemnon and Menelaus to bring Helen back to Sparta, pretended to have gone mad and began sowing the fields with salt. When Palamedes threw Odysseus' son, Telemachus, in front of the plough, Odysseus avoided him, demonstrating that he was sane. Odysseus, who never forgave Palamedes for making him reveal himself, later accused Palamedes of betraying the Greeks to the Trojans. Soon after, Palamedes was condemned and killed. In this epidictic speech, like the encomium, Gorgias is concerned with experimenting with how plausible arguments can cause conventional truths to be doubted. Throughout the text, Gorgias presents a method for composing logical, ethical and emotional arguments from possibility, which are similar to those described by Aristotle in rhetoric. These types of arguments about motive and capability presented in the defense are later described by Aristotle as forensic topoi. Gorgias demonstrates that in order to prove that treason had been committed, a set of possible occurrences also need to be established. In the defense, these occurrences are as follows: communication between Palamedes and the enemy, exchange of a pledge in the form of hostages or money, and not being detected by guards or citizens. In his defense, Palamedes claims that a small sum of money would not have warranted such a large undertaking, and reasons that a large sum of money, if indeed such a transaction had been made, would require the aid of many confederates in order for it to be transported. Palamedes reasons further that such an exchange could neither have occurred at night because the guards would be watching, nor in the day because everyone would be able to see. Palamedes continues, explaining that if the aforementioned conditions were, in fact, arranged, then action would need to follow. Such action needed to take place either with or without confederates. However, if these confederates were freemen, then they were free to disclose any information they desired. But if they were slaves, there was a risk of their voluntarily accusing to earn freedom, or accusing by force when tortured. Slaves, Palamedes says, are untrustworthy. Palamedes goes on to list a variety of possible motives, all of which he proves false. Through the defense, Gorgias demonstrates that a motive requires an advantage such as status, wealth, honor, and security, and insists that Palamedes lacked a motive. Epitaphius. This text is considered to be an important contribution to the genre of epitaphius. During the 5th and 4th centuries BC, such funeral orations were delivered by well-known orators during public burial ceremonies in Athens. whereby those who died in wars were honored. Gorgias' text provides a clever critique of 5th-century propagandist rhetoric in Imperial Athens and is the basis for Plato's parody, Menechanists.